Okay, so in this second lecture, I'm going to be talking about the second meditation. The subtitle for this second meditation is On the Human Mind, and that it's better known than the body. Okay, so you want to keep in mind that subtitle throughout this lecture. Keep in mind that this is what Descartes is ultimately going to be arguing towards, this conclusion that the human mind, the intellect, is something that is known with more certainty than the body, than your physical organism. And again, remember what it means to be a rationalist philosopher. This is something that shouldn't come as any surprise to you, that Descartes is going to argue in this specific way, okay? So how does he start out here? He begins by saying that he's going to keep doubting, he's going to keep carrying out this radical, hyperbolic doubt until he's found something certain. He decides that's going to be the stopping point, and he'll have to keep going until he gets there. And he says that once he finds this certain thing, that's something like an Archimedean point. He says this on 17 or 24, depending on your version. And this is a reference, of course, to Archimedes, who was basically able to radically reorient astronomical theory, basically, by coming up with just one set point that wasn't moving, one set point from which he could recalculate various theoretical matters pertaining to heavenly bodies, to stars and planets and so on. Descartes says he needs something like that. He needs his own Archimedean point that he can fix, that he can pin down, right? Something that's not going to move, something that's a guarantee, and from which or upon which he can build everything else. But Descartes also says he may not get this point, he may not ever reach this, he may, on the other hand, have to keep doubting until he knows something else, namely that nothing is certain, right? This would mean he isn't able to find any fixed point, he isn't able to pin anything down. So how does he begin here? Well, he starts with an assumption. He says, I'm going to take my senses as false. I'm going to assume that they're fake, that they've been implanted in me, or that there's some sort of simulation, or they're in some other way illusory. They're not real, in other words. He says, I'm going to do the same thing with my memory. I'm going to assume that my memories aren't necessarily memories of things that really occurred. Maybe my memory is fake. Maybe it's, again, some trick from that evil demon. So the question here is, if we're going to take these two things as false, do I still exist? Do I only exist with my body? Do I only exist with my senses? Right? So he's kind of pairing these two things together. He says, well, even if we exclude the body and we exclude the senses, it seems like something still remains. It seems like I'm still there. Why is this the case for Descartes? He says, at the very least, I am the one who persuades myself that there is no sky, that there's no earth, that there's no mind, that there's no bodies, that there's no senses, all of these other things, right? Meaning, I can't eliminate myself from the equation, right? I'm the one who is carrying out this radical doubt. You'll see in a way that he's already kind of anticipating the famous I think, therefore I am argument. That's a big part of the logic of this book, despite the fact that he never actually says those words, contrary to what people normally think about this book. But getting back to it, Descartes says, it's true that an evil demon, an evil god, a deceiving god, could still be tricking me, though, into thinking that I am persuading myself, right? This is still a possibility. So I can't actually get rid of the we, right? I can't actually get rid of the I, unless, of course, this evil demon is tricking me into thinking that I is there, when really that I is not, right? So he's saying this is still going to be a problem. This is still going to be a possibility that would problematize his argument. However, he very quickly moves in reasoning to kind of work through and analyze this problem. He says, if the demon is deceiving me, though, right? If the demon is putting all of these false ideas into me, if the demon is making me think that I am an I, at the very least, it still seems like there's no doubt that I have to exist, right? There has to be someone who is being deceived. There has to be somebody who is the object of this cunning project on the part of this demon or this god. This demon can never make me into nothing so long as I think that I am a thing, right? So long as I have the idea of being an I, the idea of being a thing, it's not possible that this demon can make me into a non-thing. So you see here him kind of making the point that people often render as I think, therefore I am. And he does actually use that expression in other writings, but you won't find it in this book. He says, I am and I exist is something that's necessarily true, at least every time that I utter it or conceive these words in my mind, every time I have these thoughts. I am, I exist, right? It's true, at least when I have this idea before myself. And he says, even a deceiving God, even an evil demon, couldn't trick me into thinking that if it's false. It's just too much, right? I have the experience of being a thing. I cannot be made into a non-thing. But he's throwing around a lot of talk about himself. He's throwing around a lot of talk about the I. What is the I? He realizes that he's going to need to define what he's talking about here. He's using a term that could mean many different things. So he begins actually with negative definitions. He's going to set aside everything that the I is not. He says, is the I a rational animal? In the past, that's what I used to think that I was. He's referring here, he's quoting really Aristotle. Aristotle calls man a rational animal. So this is something that he doesn't really explicitly attribute to Aristotle, but I'm giving you that background here in my lecture. Descartes dismisses the idea that he's a rational animal. He says, I'd have to further define these two words. I'd have to figure out what it means to be rational, figure out what it means to be an animal. In other words, I'd need to bring up additional definitions. I'd need to define both of these things, and it's possible that even the definition that I use there would be one that would itself require even more definitions. So we would call this an infinite regress, right? I may have to just go on defining thing after thing ad infinitum until the end of time, infinitely, right? And that's a problem, because we'll never really pin anything down, will we? So you can already tell here that he's going to be looking for a definition of himself that isn't going to run into this problem. Something that's what we would call primitive, or something that's simple, something that isn't going to require additional explanation or additional definitions. So moving forward, he says, what do I seem most naturally to be a lot of the time? My body. I don't necessarily always think of myself in a mental way. I don't always think of myself as consciousness, but I do seem to have this really natural identification with my physicality, my body. So in a way, we could say the body is primary. It has primacy. We know it distinctly, as opposed to the soul, which we aren't always so sure about, right? Although Descartes notes that he does seem to have thoughts, he does seem to have appetites and desires and so on, right? So what would the soul be if not for the organ of yourself? Organ I'm using in a sort of metaphysical sense here, not organ in the sense of a liver or a kidney, right? But what would the soul be if not the organ that accounts for these appetites, these desires, these things that are extra physical, right? They're not merely physical. They may have some physical basis, but a desire, of course, is something that is also partly mental, right? So Descartes realizes there's going to be a problem with this idea that he is most naturally his body, and that is the demon could be thinking, or tricking him rather, into thinking that he is just this body, right? This is a big possibility, a big problem. In fact, this is one of the big sort of themes or ideas that you'll see in numerous sci-fi movies, whether we're talking about The Matrix or Inception or any number of other films or books, even graphic novels and so on, where the idea of having a body, the idea of external reality is just completely simulated. It's not the real thing. This is exactly what Descartes is talking about, except he's talking about it hundreds of years ago. This demon could be tricking me about having a body. He could also be tricking me about the things that I desire, my appetites, whether we're talking about appetite for food or appetite to reproduce or whatever. The demon could also be tricking me into thinking that I'm moving around, even tricking me into thinking that I have senses, right? Which, without having a body, wouldn't make much sense at all. They'd just be totally fake. They'd be totally nonsensical, incoherent, the idea of having sensation without a body. But here's the problem, Descartes says. Can the demon trick me into thinking? I've said a lot of things that the demon can trick me into doing, but can he trick me into having thoughts? Can he trick me into, more specifically, more importantly, the experience of thinking? And this is one of the most important parts of the book. You want to make sure that you really understand what's happening here before we move on, because a lot of things rely upon this next move. Descartes' going to say, thought exists. It alone cannot be separated from me. So I exist. This is certain. But for how long is this certain? For as long as I am thinking. For perhaps it could also come to pass that if I were to cease all thinking, I would then utterly cease to exist. So this is the I think therefore I am part, where he doesn't actually say those words. Cogito ergo sum in Latin, je pense donc je suis in French. You'll see this throughout pop culture and all sorts of various cultural works, right? The probably most famous idea that we attribute to Descartes. Notice what he's saying here, though. When I have the experience of thinking, right, I can be certain in that moment that I exist. But when I'm just sitting zoning out, when I'm not thinking, I can't be sure of that at all. So that's an important thing to take note of. So what am I? Remember, we're working here towards a definition of the I. He says, I am precisely nothing but a thinking thing, meaning a mind, intellect, or understanding, or reason. I am a thinking thing. So he thinks that this is a primitive sort of definition of himself. It's not something that will require further definitions like we saw with rational animal, explaining what an animal is, how it's distinguished from other things, explaining what rationality is. He thinks that a thinking thing is something that kind of just speaks for itself. It's really simple. But is it enough? Is there anything else that he is? For example, is the imagination part of him? And if it is, doesn't that mean that everything that he thinks and the conclusions that he draws about his thoughts and how they corroborate or prove his existence could be made up, could be illusory rather than real? So this is the next problem. Descartes says, we don't need to worry about this. We're actually okay here, because the I, the self, this sense of consciousness that I have isn't dependent on the ideas in my imagination or the simulations of my imagination. What does he use for proof here? Well, he says, you never learn more about yourself in a dream. What happens in a dream is you perceive things less clearly and distinctly rather than more clearly and distinctly. A dream will never tell you something that you knew already in waking life, but will tell you it more clearly. So this obviously flies sort of in the face of psychoanalysis and Freud and Jung and Lacan and so on. Although even these famous psychoanalysts thought that dream content had a sort of mysterious nature and had to be interpreted by a professional, right? I mean, that's precisely the reason why psychoanalysis was necessary. You had to go find one of these people who perhaps pseudo-scientifically told you what this confusing, strange dream meant, right? So it's both similar and different here. But getting back to Descartes, Descartes thinks that this alone is enough of a reason to conclude that you never really have your I dependent upon the imagination. It's dependent upon the intellect, rationality, the mind, this sort of really calculating part of you, this really analytic part of you, but not the creative, flourishing imagination. So moving on, what does it mean to think then? Now that I'm sure that I think, now that I'm sure that I'm a thinking thing, now that I know that I am not just imagining it, he is going to give us a list of things that he includes here. He's not really defining thinking, as I already told you, but rather he's going to sort of set up thinking as a heading or a category and give us everything that he puts inside of this category. And you'll see that it's actually kind of a broad list. This is sort of surprising, everything that he puts in here. He says thinking includes doubting, understanding, affirmation, denying, willing, refusing, but also, and these are the surprising ones, especially considering what he said so far, imagination and sensation. Now, the I does fall outside of the scope of the imagination. Even if the imagination is false, even if it produces these things that don't have any supposed actual reality, it is the I that uses the imagination. And this is another way to tell that the I is sort of prior to the imagination. It doesn't depend upon the imagination. But here's the next big problem that he's going to face, the next big question that he has to address. Why is it, if everything that I've said here is true about how I am most properly a thinking thing, how I am most properly my mind, why does it seem like I know bodies more distinctly than the eye? Why does it seem like when I tap on my desk or when I touch my arm that there's a sort of realness, a sort of directness, a sort of self-evidentness to this that is just far and above what I have when I focus upon the eye? Even if I go into the bathroom and I look into the mirror and stare into my own eyes and try to really to think about myself and focus and reflect upon myself and my consciousness and my ego, that still has a major difference, doesn't it? It seems kind of quote-unquote less real than the realness of the desk that you touch or the realness of the arm that you touch. So why is this? Well, Descartes is going to explain why this is the case and how we can get around this seeming problem with one of the most famous parts of the book. This is probably the second most famous part of the Meditations, aside from the argument cogito ergo sum. And notice I said, of course, argument, not quote, because as I told you, it's not a quote from the book. But Descartes is going to take up this famous wax example. He's going to comment upon how in his study he's sitting next to a wax candle, we'll imagine it. And he's going to say that he knows a lot about the wax by using his senses, right? So again, we're talking about something physical here, just like the desk or your arm. He knows by way of his senses what the wax feels like, what it smells like. He could taste it and it would have a flavor. He could touch or knock on it and it would produce a certain sound. But there's something weird. Descartes can melt this candle. He can melt this candle, he can melt this wax, and it will look completely different to his senses. It will smell different, it will feel different, it will taste different, it will sound different if he touches it. It will be completely different in terms of its sensory qualities. But here's the thing, Descartes is able to identify that it's the same thing, isn't he? He's able to identify the enduring substance. He's able to tell that it's the same wax, even after it melts, even after everything about it appears to be different. Now, obviously, it cannot be his senses that are telling him it's the same thing. The senses are telling him it's something completely new. It's something completely different. Imagine if you completely destroyed your dog's favorite toy and it looked different and even smelled different. Of course, that's important to note for an animal with as keen of a sense of smell as a dog. Your dog would probably think it's some different thing. Your dog maybe would not know that it is her favorite toy. So, in your case, that isn't what happens, right? You know that it's the same thing. How do you know? Well, he says you know it by way of the mind alone. This is really, again, one of the most important points here. The rest of the book won't make sense to you if you don't really grasp what's going on here. A lot of the times I have students ask me, why is it still not the senses if he only knows that he's sitting next to the wax, if he only sees the wax, if he's only aware of the wax in the first place by way of the senses? Well, yes, to a certain extent that's true, right? He does become aware of this thing by way of his senses. He burns it, and he's still aware of it because he can see it, or even if he was blind, he could touch it, and even if he wasn't able to touch it, he would probably have another sense or two that he could use. But here's the thing, right? Here's the point. If we imagine someone who has all five senses, the reason why you're able to tell that it's the same thing is something that's mental. It's something intellectual. It's something that is completely an idea. It's not something that relies upon seeing the object, right? Yes, you have to know that it's still there to some extent to even make this leap, but that's not the important part. What he's saying is that it is the mind alone that knows that it's the same body. He also addresses here the question of whether it could be the imagination that knows that it's the same thing, and he says it can't be the imagination because the imagination wouldn't be able to come to terms with the infinite possible sensible properties of the wax, right? The imagination isn't capable of imagining all of the possible changes that could happen to this wax. That's an infinite list of things. So it can't be the imagination that tells you it's the same thing. It can't be the imagination by way of which you're able to identify this wax. So Descartes will say, he'll conclude, the perception of the wax is not a seeing, nor is it a touching, nor is it an imagining. It is an inspection, as I said, on the part of the mind alone. Now, one thing to note here is when Descartes talks about identifying the enduring body, identifying the enduring wax, the enduring thing, what he's talking about is a substance. And we'll find that this is also something important for his argument. Substance is actually going to be something that is rationally identified. You don't identify substance by way of your senses. You don't identify substance by way of your imagination. Rather, it's something completely intellectual and mental. So I already kind of went through a good deal of this quote. I'll pick up after the bold part there. Descartes says, this inspection, again, on the part of the mind alone, it's one that can be imperfect. It's one that can be confused. It's one that can be mistaken. It's one that could be erroneous. But this inspection is also one that can be at times clear and distinct. And this phrase here, clear and distinct, is something you're going to hear him say a lot throughout the rest of this book. It'll come to be a very important part of what he's arguing. Clarity and distinctness, or clear and distinct perception, CDP, as we'll start to refer to it in shorthand. So sometimes an inspection on the part of the mind alone can be clear and it can be distinct. And that's what we're looking at here when I am able to tell that this wax is the same thing. And as I already kind of told you a few minutes ago using an example, it's kind of entailed by this argument that so-called lower order animals couldn't pull this off. If they don't have the sort of mental, intellectual capabilities that we have, then they wouldn't be able to identify an enduring substance. I already gave you the example of the destroyed toy. And to the right here you have a few pictures of my little sister's golden doodle, a very popular dog these days. I'm sure you've seen them before. So substances are grasped by intellect alone, by pure understanding. And there's a big leap we're going to make here, a big jump, something really important. I don't perceive anything, I don't perceive any substance, I don't perceive anything as easily and as evidently as, believe it or not, my own mind, my own consciousness. Not even my body do I perceive as clearly as my mind. So this is a complete reversal of what he had said before. Remember, we were entertaining the possibility that it seems like when you touch your desk or touch your arm, that has more reality than your experience of self, your experience of ego or consciousness has. Descartes' going to say, oh, absolutely to the contrary. I actually perceive my mind more clearly, more evidently, more easily than anything else. So we'll pick up with our third meditation in the next lecture.